Welcome to this breakout session, Mind the Gap, how to meet ESG disclosure requirements and expectations in the US and the EU. This session is moderated by Margot, Cella, Vice President, Research and Anti-Fraud Initiatives at the Center for Audit Quality. Joining Margot is Richard Buckbannon, Senior Vice President, General Counsel, and Secretary for Manpower Group. Kimberly Evans, Executive Vice President, Head of Corporate Sustainability, Inclusion, and Social Impact at Northern Trust. And Julie Santoro, Partner at KPMG. This breakout session is brought to you by our partners at the Center for Audit Quality. And now, here's Margot.
Hello, I'm Margot Cella with the Center for Audit Quality. ESG reporting has greatly increased in recent years, with most companies around the globe reporting on some facet of their ESG initiatives and impacts. Much of the increase in reporting is due in large measure to demands from investors, but regulators are requiring disclosures in certain areas as well. Despite the increase in reporting, there hasn't been any uniformity in requirements or expectations across the different regions. There's a new Sustainability Standards Board that was formed by the IFRS Foundation back in November. It consolidates the Value Reporting Foundation and the Climate Disclosure Standards Board. The goal of this new board is to develop standards that result in a global baseline of sustainability-related disclosures that are of high quality and comprehensive and focused on the needs of investors and financial markets. This new board is going to build on the work of the existing sustainability reporting initiatives. So what is the state of play? The International Federation of Accountants conducted an analysis of disclosures from 1,400 companies in 22 jurisdictions. They pulled data from 100 companies in the 6 largest jurisdictions, which were the US, Germany, UK, China, India, and Japan, and 50 companies in the other 16 countries. So let's get our conversation started. We will be taking questions, so please don't be shy. I'm going to ask my panelists to briefly introduce themselves. I'm sorry to say that Richard Buckbannon was pulled away from the last minute, but he said he would join us in progress if he could. So Kim, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Margot. It's great to be here with all of you. I'm Kim Evans, Executive Vice President at Northern Trust. I am the head of Corporate Sustainability, Inclusion, and Social Impact. I've been in this role for about 4 months, but prior to that, I was running our private capital fund services business, and then prior to that, I ran our governmental sovereign wealth and Taft-Hartley Union business in the U.S., Central and South America. So quite prepared to talk about the evolution of ESG as it relates to the market and the industry, and certainly from Northern's perspective.
Great. And Julie?
Hi, thanks, Margot. So Julie Santoro, I am a partner at KPMG. I lead our ESG activities in our Department of Professional Practice, which is our national office. I have worked with ESG reporting on and off over the years. I have been privileged to work and live in a number of countries, and I came to the US in 2015. So I am actively covering global developments in this space. And the other side of me, I'm also a corporate communications specialist. So I have a deep appreciation of messaging and storytelling that I combine with my technical side.
That's wonderful. So I'm going to start with you. Most of our attendees are compliance officers. And I wanted you to sort of give us a quick overview of why these compliance folks should focus on what their companies are doing with respect to ESG disclosures.
Yeah, so for me, it's coming down to one really simple thing. So Margot talked in the introduction about surveys being done about who is doing sustainability reporting. And it's fair to say it's a lot of companies. It's also fair to say that most of it currently is voluntary. And the single reason why I think you need to pay attention in this space, it is moving incredibly fast, and we are moving away from kind of voluntary reporting. It is moving into regulation, and it is moving into compliance. And that is happening incredibly fast. And the things that are happening, what we can see happening at this stage, are not necessarily aligned. Now, that's kind of unfortunate, right? Because it means that you can't just monitor one thing. You really have to keep your eye on the ball and see what's going on. So one reason.
Yeah. So I mentioned in my intro the IFAC benchmarking study. What did we learn from this study?
So if you look at it on the face of it and you take that survey, there was just over 90% of companies who were disclosing ESG data, right? And a high percentage of that, majority, so like just over 50%, were doing a sustainability report. I think the key thing for me, and it comes back to the first point I was making about really moving into a regulatory type environment, is that doesn't mean everybody had kind of like fully baked sustainability reporting across all their material topics, talking about everything. It means that this number of companies disclose something, and at their discretion. That could have been to do with net zero commitments. It could have been GHG emissions. It could have been diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of metrics. So everybody right now gets to choose. So it was a high percentage doing a report. And within that, there were just over half of those companies were getting some kind of assurance on at least one of those metrics that they were reporting somewhere. So on the face of it, Margot, I think that looks positive in terms of where companies are right now. But I think the real story is probably a lot of work under the surface still to be done.
Yeah. Yeah. So Kimberly, I'm going to turn to you. As a multinational corporation, Northern Trust has offices in Europe, Middle East, Asia. How do you deal with all the different disclosure requirements? What are the challenges that you're finding to be compliant in these multiple jurisdictions? And Julie did mention assurance, that many companies got assurance at least around one item. Does Northern Trust look for assurance around its disclosures? I know that's a lot of questions, but I turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll just put an exclamation point on what Julie said around the volume and velocity in terms of how much is happening and the speed at which this space is evolving. And so when I think about our approach to this, moving from the voluntary space, we're doing it because it's the right thing to do. And we know it aligns well with our clients and all of our other stakeholders. But there's a lot to be said for when you're doing something at your discretion, even if there is some expectation for it in terms of then shifting gears and the pace at which we have to shift gears. It's pretty extensive. So when you think about all of the different jurisdictions that a global firm is operating in, one of the reasons why we've continued to subscribe to GRI and do the reporting according to those standards, because those really were best represented as the global standards. Now we have also done SASB, TCFD. We subscribe to a lot of the other assessments, depending on what the regulatory body is, depending on the client group and other stakeholder groups. They might be more might see one or the other more favorable. So I think our approach has been, what best way to look at this globally? What's going to get us the most, for the effort that we have to put in? And then we also do take it down to a local level and say, if there are some additional standards, frameworks.
So Julie, while we're trying to get Kim back online, what would you say from your experience are some of the challenges that companies face when trying to address different jurisdictional reporting requirements?
Yeah, I guess the first thing, listening to Kimberly, you can already hear that there's been like a very structured approach to what's happening there, kind of pushing it down to the local level. So you really have this kind of bottom-up collation of all of the data, and that is something that kind of really worries me in terms of right now, with everything moving so fast, you've got to watch all these different frameworks developing, all these kind of regulations. And I think about like, you kind of need, they're not all consistent, so you kind of need the ESG version of an accounting manual, right down to your detailed like definitions. So for example, if you just think about social metrics, diversity metrics, what that kind of means in different countries and how you're going to collate all of that. And I think about collection of emissions data, where you're going to get the information from, and is everybody in the group kind of using the same boundaries? So I really see it as the equivalent of accounting and going right down to the depth of an accounting manual. And I don't know if Kimberly would say they have something like that.
But I think also the challenge is, unlike an accounting manual, this isn't double entry bookkeeping. So,
Yes.
so there's probably lots of issues that are fungible, I guess might be the word. So Julie, are you seeing in your experience companies, whether or not their ESG issues are aligned with their business strategy, how they track data, gather it? What are some leading practices that you've observed and what are some of the pitfalls that companies should avoid?
So right now, seeing some companies that absolutely are organized in the way that you are saying, but many companies are not. For many companies are just really not at the stage of being able to pull together their kind of sustainability reporting at anywhere near the same kind of robustness as you would do the financial accounting. So basically, if we have a look at this, we kind of break it down, like where do you start from now? And we kind of break it down like the 4 E's kind of. So the first thing is you've got to educate within the organization. And that is kind of at all levels of the organization, because of course you need the teams that need the really detailed knowledge of it. But you also need to, right up to board level, you need kind of the expertise to understand what's going on. You need the people who are kind of analyzing all your risks and opportunities, if we just speak about climate risk. And actually, side note, one of the SEC's proposed disclosures is transparency about what kind of expertise you have at board level for climate risk in this analysis. So you've got to then establish a governance structure. You've got to kind of really pull this mainstream, like you would do for financial accounting. You need a board-led governance structure. And perhaps this is like the biggest task when people start getting into this, you've really got to engage with the current process owners and find out where all of this information is. Because for many companies, it's there, it's just spread all over. You could have marketing teams like fielding questions from customers and saying what the company is doing. So you've got to look at how your data is being defined, captured, reported, and another question that we're just looking at earlier, who in the organization is preparing the CDP questionnaire, where you fill in everything about your GHG emissions? Who is actually doing that? Do you know how they are responding to those questions and what kind of robustness they have there? And so the bottom line is this part of your enterprise risk management, kind of looking at all these kind of risks and opportunities? And kind of once you figure that out, you're in a position to kind of look for the efficiencies and kind of start building yourself a robust process for collecting all of this data. And I just kept talking there while you were gone, Kimberly. I don't know if any of like that kind of resonates with you, the kind of process you've gone through over the years.
It seems like it must. She's shaking her head.
I mean, I'm thinking, Julie, you must have worked at Northern Trust. It sounds like exactly the process we've gone through over the years. And again, it's evolved, but we did go through the effort in that voluntary stage when we were kicking off CSR and saying to centralize these functions for the purposes and leading assessments. And you may be around know where all of the people, processes, and platforms are that are going to serve us well. We've done that over the years, and I think for us, taking it to the next stage really is now from voluntary to not believe.
Okay, another issue there. So Julie, while we're waiting for Kim to reconnect, just wanted to get your perspectives on what you think are how companies do well with things like goals and commitments for ESG efforts. How do they communicate them internally and out to the investing public?
Yeah, so I think for anybody who's been watching right now is happening in the investor community, that the big question getting raised is kind of you have this commitment, you have a net zero commitment by 2030, 2050, broken down, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And it's then, what does that really mean for the organization? So all of the questions are circling around that. Okay, you've got a commitment, kind of what next? And I know that since the SEC's proposal has come out at the end of March, there's been other questions like, we were about to make a commitment, but if we make a commitment, then that triggers some certain disclosures under the proposal. So should we not make the commitment? Should we kind of wait and see what happens? Because then we'll have to make disclosure. I guess what I would say to that is obviously a clear no, don't wait. Because in actual fact, if you look just at the SEC's proposals, the fact that you have nothing tells its own story to investors as well. Because it means like, what are your peers doing? And it looks like you're doing nothing. But the one thing I would say and encourage everybody based on what I've seen is if there is a proposal, you're looking at commitments on the table and what you're going to say, is to truly understand what that means. And really, do you have a deep, yeah, it is great. You've committed net zero by 2050, and that's good. That's to be applauded. But the question is, do you know what that entails for you as an organization, what it will mean for you, what you are going to have to do to actually achieve that? Because like depending on the years you commit, and many companies are doing it in different layers. They'll have 2025 for like 50% reduction or 2030, and they'll kind of move on from that. And at some point, it seems very far away. And in terms of like the forecasting out that you do on the business, you think kind of it's not material because it's so far away. But as we watch what's kind of happening in the environment, and we look at how rapidly things are changing, it is coming so fast. And what looks far away today, tomorrow you'll be there and you'll have to kind of figure all of this out. The other thing I would just say is obviously, I think a lot right now of the examples I give are around climate. And that's because climate absolutely has the most attention. The SEC is focused on climate. But the one thing I would say, if you are a multinational and you are kind of watching this space, or you're just selling, you're based here, but you're selling overseas, is that other jurisdictions are looking broader than just climate. Mm-hmm. So don't be fooled into thinking it is only climate.
Yeah. Now, some of those other, like the social issues, are maybe not the right word, but softer than some of the climate issues, because some of the climate things that you were talking about, like the net zero 2030 or 2050, will actually also impact your financial reporting, because you'll be writing off what you thought were long-lived assets that are now you're going to retire earlier. So, what are some of the issues that the compliance folks should be aware of, to be asking questions when they're sitting at the table?
Yeah, so for me, what you have to do, and in effect, you see this coming through the SEC proposals, is that there needs to be a mapping within the organization. This is the commitment, and it needs to kind of work through every aspect of your kind of financial statements, every aspect of your kind of KPIs, all of those measures that you disclose to the market. And there needs to be an in-depth analysis of what the ramifications are. And I guess there are kind of two buckets there, right? There's the direct. So we have put in an energy efficient kind of heating, lighting system. But then, so that's direct. You can kind of measure that and see what you did. What's the indirect knock-on effects of that? So what is that actually like saving you over the years? What is this enabling you to do to attract customers? So what are your kind of customers like asking of you? Have you, and really, I guess the thing to measure up and compare against is always your peers. So are you lagging against what your competitors are doing? Because as markets get much more savvy in terms of looking for sustainability credentials, and customers kind of shop around, they want you to say what you are doing because it helps their credentials as well. You really, within the organization, want to watch what your competitors are doing as well. So I think for me, it is like a very thorough, a very logical process that is completely within the realms of kind of what compliance is used to be doing and used to be monitoring. It just feels a little more uncomfortable because it's subject matter. Like you said, some of it feels a little bit soft, but it's soft until it's not. So it is better to start getting grips with it now and to start your mapping, because then you can improve it kind of over time.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing to say you're going to increase diversity in your workforce or in your board or wherever, but if you don't have those baseline data, it's hard to show progress. So I'm wondering if you, given your experience, if you could tell us like which countries seem to be, or jurisdictions seem to be furthest along in some of the various ESG requirements.
So in terms of requirements, what we start to see in the initial stages is rallying around the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or the TCFD. And I think the reason the TCFD has become kind of very popular is because it lays out a framework approach. So basically, it's got, you look at your governance, you look at your strategy, you look at your risk management, and then you look at metrics and targets. And the kind of the beauty, and I think why people kind of hone in on that, is the fact that you can apply that to different areas. So if you are nowhere and you're kind of looking for a starting point, it kind of like helps you set it all up. And that's now what we see. We see the SEC in its proposals kind of looking at what the TCFD, we see that happening kind of internationally because it just sets out kind of a really nice framework for working through this.
Yeah, so we do have a question from the audience. Somebody wants to know, other than beyond the energy, what other topics do you advise organizations should be monitoring in relation to possible regulations, both in the US and abroad?
So that's a very interesting question. So climate obviously is a no-brainer because everybody is tackling that separately. What is very interesting is that if you have a look at what's happening in the EU, and many US companies, multinationals, the EU regulation, there's a proposal to broaden it that would come into effect from 2024 with 25 reporting. And that's actually completely different because that does not just look at climate, that looks much broader at kind of all your social kind of impacts as well. It looks at the intangibles, what creates the value behind the company. So that's one that's very broad and worth watching. Interestingly, what has now come out from Margot mentioned at the beginning, the International Sustainability Standards Board, at the end of March, they just released their first 2 exposure drafts, and one was climate, and you'll find, and we can compare that to the SEC, and I'm kind of bullish about that, coming together in the end. But I think the sting in the tail is the general exposure draft they have put out, and they push it back onto companies, and they say within this kind of general umbrella, you need to work out what your material topics is. And look at the SASB standards, look at all these other sources to help you do that. But you need disclosures around more than just climate, all of your material topics, but you have to work it out. So those are kind of very industry specific. But I would say as a generalization, the next thing to watch here is human capital. Mm-hmm. So we are expecting a proposal for the SEC from the SEC. It's in their reg agenda, should be coming pretty soon. That goes one step further than the principles. So we're expecting some granular proposals. We just don't know how far it is going to go. And then later this year, internationally, they're going to actually put that question out to stakeholders in general, constituents, and ask people and say, okay, we looked at climate in detail first, apart from the general stuff. What should we look at next? So, for example, should it be biodiversity? Should it be human capital? And so we'll have to kind of see how it goes. But don't be fooled into just thinking climate, even though that is getting most of the airtime right now in terms of what we're talking about.
Yeah, so I know the CAQ analyzed the S&P 500 last year, something similar to what IFAC did, but just on the S&P 500, to see how many companies were reporting ESG metrics, which ones, which frameworks they use, et cetera. And I would say, thank God I didn't have to do the work, but one of the challenges was there wasn't just one place to go and find the information. So with these new things that are coming out with the ISSB and SEC, will there be more direction as to where investors could go to find this information, or could it still be all over the place?
So typically now in the EU, and that would continue, you would go to the annual report and you'd have like an integrated report that would kind of have your financial statements and then your sustainability information. Here in the US, what the SEC is proposing is that you would have one batch of disclosures actually in your financial statements. So that would be, there's your internal controls over financial reporting. It would be subject then to audit. You would have to disclose about climate risks, physical risks, and transition risks, moving to net zero, regulation, energy efficiency, etc. And you would have to disclose by line item what those impacts are, how much you have spent during the year, whether it was capitalized or expensed. And those are kind of incredibly granular. They kind of even in there talk about a 1% materiality on a line item basis within the statements and kind of calculate that. So under the SEC proposal, you're going to have one batch in the actual financial statements. And then you're going to have the rest of the proposals actually still in your 10K. So they would kind of be in the front part in a separate section. Obviously, the first alarm bell that should be going off for you on that basis is that if this is all going to be in your 10K, then of course the timeline you are working to is the same as the timeline for your financial statements. And you know, we have all these surveys about all this reporting that companies doing, but the truth behind that is that most of them are reporting on a lag. You know, they're doing their financial stuff and then they're working out the sustainability 2, 3, 6 months later and then kind of releasing it. So this would kind of totally up the game. And basically what you would have in the front part is the first part, you'd have your GHG emissions. Everybody would have scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. Mm-hmm. They would be subject to limited assurance and then reasonable assurance for large accelerated and accelerated filers. And also you would have to do scope 3 as well if it's either material or your kind of net zero commitments, targets, goals include scope 3 kind of within that. And that really depends on the company. Scope 3 would not be subject to assurance. And if you're a smaller reporting company, you wouldn't have to disclose it. So that's the second batch of disclosures. And then the third batch of disclosures, also in the 10K, but no assurance, so in the front part, would be really talking about the governance, talking about the strategy, talking about the risk management. So really taking those pillars from the TCFD and playing that out in the 10K. They give an example actually of the timeline in the proposal. And they kind of say, if, and this is an if, we won't know until it happens, right? If they get it approved by the end of the year, well, you could be looking at first batch of disclosures being required for 2023, which is going to be in your 2024 filing. So that is, it just raises the stakes hugely and shows that even if this proposal does not come out quite like this and is kind of like a lesser version of the proposals we see now, yeah, it really just highlights how important it is to start getting organized. All those things I went through, at least like find out where all of this information is in your organization. And I see Kimberly has come back. So Margot, I'll immediately stop there.
So, what can I say? The internet, the technology gremlins are out today. I am so sorry. Oh my gosh.
That's okay. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the process that you've all used at Northern Trust and some of the commitments that you're making, that you're trying to measure and keep on pace.
Sure. So I don't know what we were working in the background, so I don't know what Julie and Margot said, but I'm going to tell you I trust them, and whatever they said, it's the right answer. So the process that we have gone through, as I was starting to say before, we did several years ago really centralize around corporate social responsibility, which is inclusive of the environmental, the social, diversity, equity, inclusion, and social impact. And so through that effort, we're responsible for the enterprise strategy for all of these different parts and, moving parts. And so when we set the corporate strategy, part of that what comes with that is coordinating across the enterprise to make sure that everybody who will touch this, whether it's from a data perspective or other information, even from an interested party perspective, right? Everybody who will touch this, we have those touch points. We have a governance structure which actually brings all of it together, starting with the board. We originally had a CSR committee on the board, but have since rolled that into the governance committee. And we also do updates, more broadly with the board. And then we have the management group or the management committee that actually looks at this, the strategy and how we're executing towards the strategy on a quarterly basis. Of course, I sit in those meetings, and so we're in those meetings much more than on a quarterly basis, but we're reporting out on a quarterly basis. We also have an enterprise council with the next level leaders. That's both for, informing what's happening in all the different spaces, but also making sure that we're getting we're tying together all the critical data points so that we can move, in unison or in an aligned way. And so in terms of, the governance structure is there, has been set for a while, and we're pretty comfortable with it. In terms of ramping up around regulation, because that governance structure was set, it was pretty easy for us to now pull together the various working groups with the streams that are now going to lead forward from where we are today, kind of the voluntary position, to now ramping up to what looks like regulation in the US, but we've been dealing with some of those regulatory requirements and mandates in the UK or in EMEA for some time. So we're not reinventing the wheel. In many cases, we're doubling down on some of the things that we've already done. So our approach has been the enterprise, and then making sure that it gets to the local levels. I did hear Julie talk about the education process. So it is making sure that every level is educated, as well as have the ability to give input and, be a part of the direct participation. The way that we are managing the next 90 days, or I guess I should say 90 days starting when the SEC released the proposal, is we do have a subset of the broader council, the broader working group, tracking to all of the industry initiatives, the industry groups, the industry working groups, and how they're interpreting various parts of the rule, how we're looking at it. We're doing that both from the perspective of being able to either sign on to an industry group's perspective of the rule, but also just trying to make sure we're understanding how everybody else is interpreting it. But that will quickly go into move from the question and comment period into, okay, now here's the plan based on how we understand it in terms of positioning ourselves for adoption. And I did hear a little bit, I think, around, that if this goes into finalization by the end of the year, we will be ready then to the compliance period would start in 2024. And so we think we have set up a governance structure with the right people, understanding, where some of the major challenges might be. I think the major challenge, and this was going to be my point to leave with everybody, the major challenge for any organization at this point, because of the volume and velocity of how things are changing and new regulation coming in, is the data. And so making sure that you have all of the particular data needs. Like one of the things we said, like, okay, we know our scope 1 and scope 2 emissions because we've been tracking that for some time, right? But if in this rule, and we've been anticipating this for some time, but if in this rule there is actually the major expectation that financial services organizations will be able to understand scope 3, well, there are a lot of data points in scope 3 that aren't even available, right? So how do we get that data? How do we structure that data? And how do we make sure that that data then becomes reportable in the way that, so I think our biggest challenge will be, some of the data elements that we haven't been necessarily tracking to. It's available information, but we know that with data, you've got to pull it in. You've got to be able to get that in a systematic way, and you've got to be able to structure it so that you can report on it. And so we have gotten limited assurance in the past around our GHG emissions. And originally, when we were doing when we issued our first sustainability or CSR report, we got assurance on the full report. So it's been a practice of ours to make sure that whatever we actually document and do, that there's some other verifiable source that can attest to or assure that what we've done is, has been structured and, can be verified. So I think that we'll continue to have that as a practice. And I know the rule contemplates that in some cases for some parts of the rule. So we will continue to do that. But just because we have been on a path, we're not taking any of that for granted. We know that there is a ramp up and that we have more work to do, more significant work to do. But that nuance of, and it's not really a nuance, but it depends on how you view it. We see the shift being pretty big in terms of going from voluntary to mandatory, and the consistency of it all. So we are not taking it lightly, and we're gearing up. But we do believe that we've done a lot of good things, GRI, SASB, TCFD, CDP, whatever acronym you can throw at us, we've probably had some engagement and interaction with it already. And we consider that the foundation for our learning at this point, and so we'll continue to evolve. But we understand that there is a lot of work ahead of us, even though we've done a lot to this point.
And are you fairly confident that your operations in all these different countries are marching to the same beat and collecting the data the same way? Because I think that might be a challenge for some companies.
Well, and the same way, I mean, that small part of like marching to the same beat, I know the answer to that is yes, because the way that we're organized, kind of forces that. But in terms of gathering all the same things, and I'll just give an example of, diversity data, for example, and that's not specifically in this rule, but we know the human capital part is coming next. There are some countries that don't allow you to ask certain questions, right, around diversity. And so where we have the data, we can legitimately ask the questions, or we can legitimately grab the data. We are doing it, but it's only to the degree, in instances where the jurisdictions do not allow for certain things, then we don't do it. But otherwise, our framework is pretty global, and everybody's, moving in alignment with that.
Great. So Julie, we do have a question about the 2021 GRI standards revisions. How will that change the way companies look at their disclosures?
So when I think about the GRI, when I started off once upon a time looking at ESG reporting, GRI was kind of the biggest thing out there. And if you were looking at how to put together a sustainability report, it was really great because it lays out this framework for you and for readers as well, because most companies put their index in there and they kind of map it across the pages, kind of where you are in the GRI index. I think what we've seen in the last couple of years is questions about the ongoing relevance of GRI. Because yes, it's still the biggest framework if you look that people are following, But with the massive momentum behind the International Sustainability Standards Board, they use a much narrower focus. It's focused on investors, whereas GRI is more like the EU requirements that look at all your broader, your kind of responsibilities to society and your kind of broader impact. So GRI signed a cooperation agreement last year with the EU in terms of when their proposed regulation. I think it was just in the last couple of weeks, maybe 2 weeks ago, they signed now a cooperation agreement, if that's the right word for it, with the ISSB, with the IFRS Foundation. So as we go through, we're going to see more and more collaboration between these organizations, which is really, really great for companies in terms of one day, hopefully, getting to like kind of one basic set of rules that you can kind of follow. So I would say the revisions per se, I haven't been tracking those, the specific ones. I've just more been tracking GRI as a whole and where they're placed in the kind of acronym ecosystem is. Yeah, so I think that's probably half an answer to that question.
Okay. So we're coming up to the end of our time here. We just have a time for a couple of more questions. And so, Julie, I wanted to ask you if there was anything more you wanted this audience to know about the ISSB exposure drafts that came, exposure drafts that came out on March 31st. That they should be paying attention to. I think that's a 120-day comment period, if I recall.
Yes, it's more than the 60 days from the SEC. So for sure, it's like double. So I think my overall message would be, don't wait. The situation is settling. Have a look at these things. Even if if your trade association is going to respond on your behalf, you've got to make sure you have a look at these things and start looking at where you are vis-a-vis them. And yes, if you're multinational, you absolutely want to look not just at the SEC, but please have a look at ISSB as well. That would be my last message.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so our audience should be going back to their company and asking questions of the board, of the senior management, the financial management, just to make sure that everybody is sort of focused on what's coming down the pike. So Kim, do you have any thoughts, key takeaways that you would want the audience here to remember?
Yeah, I mean, similar along the same lines as Julie, don't wait. I would say get plugged in. And again, when you're thinking about how this has evolved and how quickly it's evolving, you want to be, I learned this, I used to play volleyball, although I'm not that tall, but I was pretty scrappy on the floor. And it was every time my coach would say, well, Kimberly, you're not on your toes, right? So I would say the message is stay on your toes, get plugged in, because it's going to have a few more, blips on the radar in terms of where we go and how we do, how we pivot. But you've got to already be on your toes. It's moving too fast to stand flat-footed and wait for somebody else to figure it out. You've got to be moving along with it. And so that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, thanks. Great advice. Thank you, Kimberly, and thank you, Julie, and thank you, audience, for your attention today.
Thank you.